The funeral flowers were still fresh on Robert's grave when I returned home to find my daughter-in-law Victoria sitting at my kitchen table, spreading papers across the surface like she owned the place. Which, according to her calculations, she apparently thought she did. "There you are, Patricia," she said without looking up from what appeared to be financial documents and real estate listings. "We need to have a serious conversation about your future." My future. 3 days after burying my husband of 38 years, and Victoria was already planning my future like I was an inconvenient piece of furniture that needed to be relocated. "I was visiting Robert's grave," I said quietly, hanging my black coat in the closet. "I wanted to bring him fresh roses." "That's sweet," Victoria said with the kind of dismissive tone people use when they're humoring someone they consider mentally diminished. "But Patricia, we need to focus on practical matters now. Grief is a luxury you can't afford." "Grief is a luxury I can't afford." The woman who'd never worked a day in her life, who'd married my son Thomas for his steady engineering salary and what she assumed would be a comfortable inheritance, was lecturing me about financial practicality. "What practical matters?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this conversation was heading. "Your living situation, obviously." Victoria gestured around the kitchen that Robert and I had renovated just 5 years ago, when we'd finally decided to splurge on the granite countertops and professional-grade appliances we'd always dreamed of. "This house is far too big for one person, and frankly, you can't afford to maintain it on your widow's pension." Widow's pension. She made it sound like I was some charity case dependent on government handouts. If only she knew that the struggling widow she was so generously offering to help had been receiving dividend checks larger than Thomas's annual salary for the past 15 years. "I suppose the house is rather large," I admitted, playing my part perfectly. "Robert and I had bought this 4-bedroom colonial 30 years ago when Thomas was still a teenager, planning for grandchildren who never came and a retirement we'd thought we'd spend together." "Exactly." Victoria's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who thought she was about to solve all her problems. "Thomas and I have been looking at houses in this neighborhood for years, but everything's been out of our price range." Out of their price range. Thomas made $75,000 a year as a civil engineer, which was respectable but not enough for the kind of lifestyle Victoria craved. She'd been dropping hints about investment opportunities and family financial planning ever since Robert's cancer diagnosis 6 months ago. "I found you the perfect place," she continued, pulling out a brochure that made my heart sink. "Sunset Manor has excellent reviews, and the monthly fee is very reasonable when you consider what you'd save on utilities, maintenance, and groceries." Sunset Manor. I'd driven past it several times, a grim institutional building that warehoused elderly people in small rooms that smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. The kind of place where families deposited inconvenient relatives and visited twice a year with forced smiles and cheap flowers. "It's quite affordable," I said, reading the brochure with growing horror. "Only $2,800 a month. Plus a small entrance fee," Victoria added quickly. "But that's where the house sale comes in. We've already had it appraised." Already had it appraised. The funeral was 3 days ago, and she'd already had our home appraised like a piece of merchandise to be liquidated. "The market is very strong right now," she continued, pulling out another document. "We could get $450,000, maybe more if we stage it properly." $450,000. She was planning to sell the house Robert and I had called home for 3 decades, pocket the money, and warehouse me in a facility that would consume my supposed life savings in monthly fees. "Of course, Thomas and I would handle all the details for you," Victoria said magnanimously. "The real estate agent, the moving company, the financial arrangements. You wouldn't have to worry about anything." "I wouldn't have to worry about anything because I wouldn't have any control over anything." The plan was elegant in its simplicity: convince the grieving widow that she couldn't manage on her own, sell her assets, and control the proceeds while she slowly deteriorated in institutional care. "That's very thoughtful of you," I managed, my voice appropriately shaky with age and grief. "We're family," Victoria said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thomas and I just want to take care of you." Take care of me. The way vultures take care of roadkill. Thomas chose that moment to arrive home from work, his tie loosened and his face carrying the exhausted expression of a man who'd been dealing with funeral arrangements and family drama for the past week. He kissed my forehead with genuine affection, the same way he had since childhood, and I felt a pang of grief for the sweet boy he'd been before Victoria had gotten her claws into him. "How are you holding up, Mom?" he asked, sitting heavily at the kitchen table. "Your mother and I have been discussing her living situation," Victoria announced before I could answer. "I think we found a perfect solution." Thomas looked at the brochures and documents scattered across the table, his expression growing increasingly uncomfortable. "Victoria, don't you think we should wait a little while before making major decisions? Dad's only been gone 3 days." "Thomas, grief doesn't stop financial reality," Victoria said sharply. "Your mother can't afford to maintain this house on her own, and we can't afford to subsidize her lifestyle indefinitely." "Subsidize my lifestyle?" As if the woman who spent more on handbags than most people made in a month was concerned about financial efficiency. "Maybe we could help with the bills," Thomas suggested weakly. "Just until Mom gets back on her feet." "With what money?" Victoria's voice took on the edge that had become increasingly familiar over the past few years. "Thomas, we have our own financial goals. We've been trying to buy a house for 3 years, and this is the perfect opportunity to solve everyone's problems at once." The perfect opportunity. My husband's death was the perfect opportunity for Victoria to finally get the lifestyle upgrade she'd been craving since the day she married my son. "I just think we should take some time," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Think things through." "There's nothing to think through," Victoria snapped. "Patricia can't live here alone. She's 74 years old, she has no income except Social Security, and this house is falling apart." "This house is falling apart." I looked around the kitchen with its gleaming appliances and recently updated fixtures, the hardwood floors Robert had refinished just 2 years ago, the custom cabinets we'd saved for years to afford. If this house was falling apart, it was news to me. "The roof needs work," Victoria continued, warming to her theme. "The heating system is ancient. The plumbing probably hasn't been updated since the house was built. The roof had been replaced 4 years ago. The heating system was a high-efficiency unit installed 6 years ago. The plumbing had been completely updated during our kitchen renovation. But Victoria was counting on the assumption that I was too old and grief-stricken to remember these details clearly. "Perhaps you're right," I said slowly, letting exhaustion creep into my voice. "I suppose I haven't been thinking clearly since Robert passed." "Of course you haven't," Victoria said with false sympathy. "That's why you need family to help you make these important decisions." Family. I wondered what Robert would have thought about his daughter-in-law's definition of family support. "When would you want me to move?" I asked, though the question felt like swallowing glass. "As soon as possible," Victoria said, barely containing her excitement. "I've already spoken to the admissions coordinator at Sunset Manor. They have a room available next month." Next month. For weeks to dismantle a lifetime, to pack up 30 years of memories and reduce them to whatever would fit in a studio apartment that smelled like institutional cleaning supplies. "What about Dad's things?" Thomas asked, finally showing some backbone. "His workshop, his books, his collection." Robert's workshop. The basement space where he'd spent countless hours building furniture, fixing appliances, creating beautiful things with his hands. His collection of vintage woodworking tools, some inherited from his father, others acquired over decades of craftsmanship. His library of technical manuals and classic literature, books he'd read and reread until the spines were soft with handling. "We'll have an estate sale," Victoria said briskly. "Whatever doesn't sell, we'll donate. Patricia certainly can't take all of that to Sunset Manor." An estate sale. Robert's tools, his books, his lifetime accumulation of meaningful objects would be scattered to strangers who'd never know their stories, never understand their significance. Items that represented a man's passion and skill would be reduced to price tags and bargain hunting. "I'd like to keep a few things," I said quietly. "Some photographs, maybe one of his woodworking projects." "Of course," Victoria said magnanimously. "You can keep anything that fits in your new room. Just remember, space will be very limited." Limited space for a limited life. Everything Robert and I had built together, all our shared memories and accumulated treasures, reduced to whatever would fit in a space the size of a large bedroom. My phone buzzed in my purse, a text from my financial advisor asking about the quarterly portfolio review we'd scheduled for next week. I quickly turned off the sound, not wanting Victoria to ask questions about who might be texting the poor widow who supposedly had no business or financial contacts. I should probably start going through things, I said, standing slowly and letting my age show in the movement. This is all so overwhelming. Don't worry about it tonight, Thomas said gently. You need to rest. We can start making plans tomorrow. Plans? Yes, Victoria certainly had plans. What she didn't know was that I had a few plans of my own. As they prepared to leave, Victoria gathered up her brochures and documents with the satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. Patricia, I know this is hard, but you'll see, this is really the best thing for everyone. The best thing for everyone. Meaning the best thing for Victoria, who would finally get the house she'd been coveting for years, and the best thing for Thomas, who wouldn't have to deal with the guilt of his wife's obvious resentment toward his mother. I'm sure you're right, I said, walking them to the door. Thank you for taking such good care of me. Victoria beamed at the praise, clearly thrilled that her plan was proceeding so smoothly. Thomas looked less comfortable, but he'd long since learned that agreeing with his wife was easier than fighting her. After they left, I sat in the silence of the house Robert and I had shared for so many years. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking time the way it had for decades, indifferent to grief or greed or the machinations of people who mistook kindness for weakness. I walked to Robert's study, where his computer still sat on the desk we'd bought together 15 years ago. The screensaver showed a slideshow of our favorite photos, trips we'd taken, holidays we'd celebrated, quiet moments that had made up the fabric of our life together. Opening the laptop, I logged into the secure account that Victoria knew nothing about, the one connected to investments and properties and business ventures that had made Robert and me comfortable beyond our wildest early dreams. The quarterly reports showed continued growth, dividend payments that exceeded Thomas's salary, asset values that would have shocked anyone who thought of us as a comfortable middle-class couple. Tomorrow, Victoria would probably start making calls about real estate agents and moving companies. She'd begin the process of dismantling my life and redistributing my assets according to her plans. But tonight, I had some calls of my own to make. The inheritance she was counting on, the house she'd already claimed in her mind, the future she'd planned so carefully, all of it was about to become much more complicated than she'd anticipated. Victoria thought she was dealing with a helpless widow who could be manipulated through grief and fear. What she didn't know was that the old bat she'd dismissed so casually had been making strategic decisions about money and property for longer than Victoria had been alive. Some lessons, I reflected as I reached for my phone, could only be taught through experience. And some people needed to learn the hard way that underestimating others was a very expensive mistake. Tomorrow would be a very educational day for my daughter-in-law. Part 2, The Will Reading and the Widow's Secrets. The call came at 7 a.m., precisely 1 week after the funeral. Victoria's voice was sharp with barely contained excitement, though she was trying to sound appropriately somber for someone discussing her father-in-law's final wishes. Patricia, the lawyer called. Robert's will reading is scheduled for this afternoon at 2 o'clock. Thomas and I will pick you up at 1:30. Robert's will reading. The moment Victoria had been waiting for since the day she married my son, though she'd never been crude enough to say so directly. In her mind, today would be the day her financial future was secured, when the comfortable inheritance she'd been counting on would finally become reality. Of course, I said, keeping my voice appropriately fragile. Should I bring anything? Just yourself, Victoria said with false warmth. Thomas and I will handle all the legal details. All the legal details. I wondered if Victoria had any idea how many legal details had been handled over the years, how many documents had been filed, how many trusts and transfers had been executed while she'd been planning her future spending sprees. I'll be ready, I promised. The law office of Bennett, Morrison and Associates occupied the top floor of the newest building in our small town's modest business district. Victoria had clearly dressed for the occasion in her best black suit, the expensive one she'd bought for job interviews she'd never actually attended, and her most impressive jewelry. She looked like someone attending a very profitable funeral. Thomas, on the other hand, looked uncomfortable in the way that had become his default expression whenever money was discussed. He helped me out of the car with genuine concern, his hand steady on my elbow as we made our way across the parking lot. Are you sure you're up for this, Mom? He asked quietly. We could postpone if you need more time. I think Robert would want us to get his affairs settled, I said, which was absolutely true, though not in the way Thomas imagined. James Bennett had been Robert's and my attorney for over 20 years, handling everything from our house purchase to our business incorporations to the complex estate planning that Victoria knew nothing about. He greeted us in the lobby with the perfect balance of professional sympathy and legal precision. "Mrs. Morrison, Thomas, Victoria," he said, shaking hands with each of us in turn. "Please, come into the conference room. We have quite a bit to cover today." Quite a bit to cover. Victoria's eyes practically glowed with anticipation as we settled around the polished mahogany table. She'd positioned herself directly across from James, clearly wanting to see every document, catch every detail of what she assumed would be her financial windfall. "Before we begin," James said, opening a thick file folder, "I want to explain that Robert's estate is somewhat more complex than might be immediately apparent." "Complex how?" Victoria asked, leaning forward eagerly. "Well, let's start with the house," James said, pulling out the first document. "The property at 412 Maple Street, currently valued at approximately $450,000. Victoria nodded approvingly. That matched the appraisal she'd secretly commissioned, the one she thought I didn't know about. "According to Robert's will," James continued, "the house is left in its entirety to his wife, Patricia Morrison, to remain her property for the duration of her natural life." "Of course," Victoria said quickly. "We understand that. We're planning to help Patricia sell it so she can move to more appropriate accommodations." James looked at me with the slight smile that had become familiar over our years of working together. "Actually, Victoria, Patricia doesn't need to sell the house. She owns it outright, and has for many years." "Well, yes, but she can't afford the upkeep," Victoria pressed. "The taxes alone are automatically paid through the Morrison Family Trust," James said, pulling out another document. "Have been for the past 15 years. The Morrison Family Trust." I watched Victoria's face carefully as James explained the trust structure, the way her confident expression slowly shifted to confusion and then growing alarm. "I don't understand," she said. "What family trust?" "The trust Robert and Patricia established in 2008, James explained patiently. "It holds the majority of their assets and provides for all property maintenance, taxes, and living expenses." "Their assets?" Victoria's voice was getting higher. "What assets?" That's when James began pulling out more documents, spreading them across the table like a roadmap to a fortune Victoria had never imagined existed. Bank statements, investment portfolios, business ownership documents, property deeds, a paper trail that painted a picture of wealth accumulated quietly over decades. "Morrison Construction Consulting has been generating steady revenue for 23 years, James said. "Currently about $600,000 annually. Morrison Property Holdings owns 17 rental properties across 3 counties. And then there are the investment accounts." I watched Victoria's face go through several shades of pale as the numbers mounted. Thomas looked stunned, his mouth literally hanging open as he processed the reality that his comfortable middle-class parents had been millionaires for most of his adult life. "This can't be right," Victoria whispered. "They lived so modestly. Their car is 12 years old. Patricia shops at discount stores." "Financial privacy was very important to Robert and Patricia," James said diplomatically. "They preferred to live below their means rather than display their wealth." "But why?" Victoria demanded, her careful composure finally cracking. "Why would they live like they were struggling when they had all this money?" "Because," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since we'd entered the conference room, "we wanted to know that the people who loved us weren't motivated by money." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stared at me like I'd suddenly revealed myself to be an alien, while Thomas continued processing the revelation that his entire understanding of his family's financial situation had been completely wrong. "Let's continue with the specific bequests," James said, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional tension in the room. "To Thomas Morrison, Robert leaves his complete workshop, including all tools and equipment, plus the contents of his personal library." Thomas nodded numbly. "His father's workshop and books, meaningful gifts, but probably worth less than $50,000 total. And the rest?" Victoria asked, her voice barely controlled. "The remainder of Robert's estate," James said, "approximately $8.7 million, is left in trust for Patricia Morrison's lifetime care and comfort. $8.7 million. Victoria made a sound like she'd been punched in the stomach. After Patricia's death, James continued, the principal amount will be donated to various charities specified in the will. Donated? Victoria's voice cracked. To charity. Robert was very specific about his philanthropic intentions, James confirmed. The local children's hospital, the Literacy Foundation, the scholarship fund at the community college. But what about Thomas? Victoria demanded. What about his inheritance? James looked at Thomas with genuine sympathy. Your father felt that you'd received your inheritance already, your education, your values, the knowledge and skills to make your own way in the world. That's not an inheritance. Victoria exploded. That's nothing. Actually, I said calmly, that's everything that really matters. Victoria turned on me with fury that she was no longer trying to hide. You planned this. You and Robert planned to cut Thomas out of everything. We planned to make sure Thomas became a man who could stand on his own, I corrected. Someone who'd choose a wife based on love rather than money, who'd build a life based on his own accomplishments rather than waiting for his parents to die. This is insane. Victoria was on her feet now, pacing behind her chair like a caged animal. Thomas is your son. He deserves his fair share. Thomas will always be provided for, I said. The trust includes provisions for genuine emergencies, educational expenses for any future grandchildren, medical care if needed. But not inheritance, Victoria said bitterly. Not money he didn't earn, I confirmed. James cleared his throat diplomatically. There is one additional provision in Robert's will that we should discuss. What now? Victoria snapped. A codicil added 6 months ago, during his final illness. James pulled out another document. If anyone attempts to manipulate Patricia into selling her home, moving to institutional care, or transferring her assets under false pretenses. What happens? Thomas asked quietly. They forfeit any and all emergency provisions from the trust, James said. Permanently. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents. Victoria had gone very still, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. What constitutes manipulation? She asked finally. Oh, the usual things, I said casually. Lying about someone's financial situation. Secretly commissioning property appraisals. Making arrangements for nursing home care without consent. That sort of thing. Victoria's face went white. You know. I've known for weeks, I confirmed. Did you really think I wouldn't notice when someone was impersonating me to get information about my accounts? When real estate agents started calling about property assessments I never requested. You were grieving, Victoria said weakly. You weren't thinking clearly. I was grieving, I agreed. But I was thinking very clearly indeed. Clear enough to have my attorney document every phone call you made, every lie you told, every plan you made behind my back. James pulled out one final folder, this one thick with printed emails, recorded phone conversations, and detailed timelines. Victoria, you do understand that identity theft and elder fraud are federal crimes. I was trying to help, Victoria protested, but her voice had lost all conviction. You were trying to steal, I said simply. And now you've forfeited any claim to the emergency provisions of Robert's trust. Thomas had been silent through most of this exchange, but now he spoke up, his voice heavy with shame. Mom, I'm so sorry. I had no idea what she was planning. I know you didn't, I said gently. Your father and I raised you to be honest and trusting. We never imagined you'd marry someone who'd see those qualities as weaknesses to exploit. This isn't over, Victoria said suddenly, her desperation making her voice shrill. I'll contest the will. I'll prove you manipulated a dying man into cutting out his only son. You're welcome to try, James said mildly. The will was executed with multiple witnesses, recorded consultations, and psychological evaluations confirming Robert's competency. Also, since Thomas wasn't technically cut out of anything, he was never promised an inheritance to begin with, there's no basis for a contest. But the money was always Robert's and Patricia's to dispose of as they saw fit, James finished. They chose to use it to help their community rather than enable someone they considered unworthy of their son. Victoria stared at me with naked hatred. You destroyed my marriage. No, I said sadly, you did that yourself. The moment you decided my husband's death was your opportunity for profit. Thomas. Victoria turned to her husband desperately. Say something. Fight for us. Thomas looked at his wife for a long moment, then at the document spread across the table that proved she'd been planning to warehouse his mother in a nursing home while stealing her assets. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. I think you should leave, Victoria. Leave. Go home. Pack your things. I need time to think about whether I can stay married to someone who'd do this to my mother. Victoria's face went through several more shades of pale. Thomas, you can't be serious. I'm your wife. A wife who tried to steal from my mother while she was grieving my father's death, Thomas said. A wife who saw Dad's funeral as a business opportunity. I was securing our future. You were destroying our family, Thomas said. There's a difference. Victoria looked around the room wildly, as if expecting someone to come to her defense, to tell her that her plans had been reasonable and justified. Instead, she found three faces looking back at her with expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. This isn't how this was supposed to go, she said finally, her voice breaking. No, I agreed, it's not. You were supposed to be a daughter to me, Victoria. You were supposed to love my son for who he is, not what you thought he might inherit. You were supposed to be family. I am family. Family doesn't steal from each other, I said simply. Family doesn't lie and manipulate and plan to warehouse elderly relatives for profit. Victoria looked at Thomas one more time, but whatever she saw in his face told her that her husband was no longer the malleable man she'd married. Without another word, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the conference room, her heels clicking angrily against the marble floor. I'm sorry, Mom, Thomas said after she'd gone. I'm so sorry for everything. I know you are, I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. And your father knew you were a good man who'd made a bad choice. That's why he structured the trust the way he did. What do you mean? James smiled and pulled out one final document. The codicil about forfeiting emergency provisions? It only applies to your wife, not to you. I don't understand. If you choose to divorce Victoria and demonstrate that you can't be manipulated into betraying your family's trust, I explained, then you're eligible for a different inheritance entirely. What kind of inheritance? A partnership in Morrison Construction Consulting, James said. Your father always hoped you'd join the family business someday. Thomas stared at the document James handed him, his eyes filling with tears. Dad wanted me to work with him. He wanted you to own the right to work with him, I corrected. He wanted to know that you'd choose family loyalty over easy money, that you'd protect the people you love instead of enabling those who'd hurt them. And if I don't divorce Victoria? Then you'll have the life you've chosen, I said. A modest engineering salary and a wife who'll spend the rest of your marriage resenting me for not dying fast enough to fund her lifestyle. Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands, probably thinking about the conversation he'd have to have with Victoria when he got home. When he looked up, his eyes held a resolution I hadn't seen since he was a child. When can I start? He asked. Start what? Learning the family business, he said. I have a lot to make up for. I smiled, thinking of Robert and how proud he'd be to see his son finally choosing the right path. Tomorrow morning, I said. 8 a.m. sharp. Your father always believed the early bird caught the worm. And Victoria will have to decide if she wants to be married to a man who puts family before money, I said. My guess is that decision won't take her very long. As we left the law office, Thomas walked beside me with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to take family for granted. The parking lot was empty except for our car. Victoria had apparently found her own way home, probably already planning her next move. Mom, Thomas said as he helped me into the passenger seat. Yes. Thank you for giving me a chance to do the right thing. Thank you for taking it, I said. Your father was betting that you would. As we drove home, I thought about Victoria's parting words. She was right that this wasn't how she'd expected things to go. She'd seen Robert's funeral as the beginning of her financial upgrade, the moment when the struggling middle-class wife would finally gain access to the comfortable inheritance she'd been counting on instead, she'd discovered that the old bat she'd dismissed so casually was worth nearly $9 million, and that her careful plans for manipulation and theft had cost her everything she'd thought she was gaining. Some lessons, I reflected as we pulled into the driveway of the house Victoria would never own, could only be learned through consequences. And some people needed to discover the hard way that family loyalty was worth more than money, but only if you were smart enough to choose the right family to be loyal to. Tomorrow, Thomas would start learning the business his father had built. Victoria would start learning what it meant to be married to a man who couldn't be manipulated. And I would start the next chapter of my life, surrounded by people who loved me for who I was rather than what they thought they could take from me. Robert would have been proud. Part 3. The Final Inheritance. 2 weeks after the will reading, I was sitting in Robert's study reviewing quarterly reports when I heard the unmistakable sound of Victoria's car in the driveway. The engine noise was different, rougher, with the irregular idle that suggested serious mechanical problems she couldn't afford to fix. Through the window, I watched her struggle with 3 overstuffed suitcases and a cardboard box that had clearly seen better days. Thomas emerged from the house to help her, but his movements were careful, distant, the posture of a man who was being polite rather than loving. The divorce papers had been filed 5 days ago. Victoria had lasted exactly 9 days as the wife of a man who'd chosen family loyalty over financial convenience. 9 days of watching Thomas leave for work each morning with genuine enthusiasm, coming home each evening with stories about learning the family business, talking about projects and plans that didn't include her. 9 days of realizing that her husband was happier without her manipulation than he'd ever been with her promises. She'd tried, of course. Ties, threats, attempts at seduction, elaborate promises about how she'd change, how she'd learned her lesson, how things would be different if he'd just give her another chance. But Thomas had finally seen his wife clearly, and what he'd seen was someone who viewed love as a transaction and family as a source of profit. "I'm not the man you married," he'd told her finally. "I'm the man my parents raised me to be. If you can't love that man, then we don't have a marriage worth saving." Now I watched from my window as Victoria loaded her possessions into a car that barely sounded roadworthy, preparing to move into the 1-bedroom apartment she'd rented across town. The same apartment complex where I'd secretly owned 6 units for the past 12 years, generating steady rental income that Victoria would never know about. My phone rang as Victoria's car disappeared down the street, coughing exhaust and making concerning metallic noises. "Patricia? This is Sandra Fleming from Sunset Manor." Sunset Manor. The nursing home where Victoria had planned to warehouse me while she stole my assets. I'd almost forgotten about the deposit Victoria had put down to secure my spot. "Hello, Sandra. How can I help you?" "I'm calling about your placement deposit. Since you've decided not to move in with us after all, I wanted to discuss the refund process." "Refund?" I asked, though I already knew where this conversation was heading. "Well, according to our records, the deposit was paid by your daughter-in-law, Victoria Thompson. She specified that the refund should go directly to her, to reimburse her for the advance payment." Of course she had. Even now, even after losing everything else, Victoria was still trying to extract money from the situation. "Sandra," I said gently, "I think there may have been some confusion. I never authorized Victoria to make that deposit on my behalf." "Oh." Sandra's voice became noticeably less friendly. "Well, she said she was handling your financial arrangements." "Without my knowledge or consent," I confirmed. "In fact, I've never had any intention of moving to Sunset Manor. The entire arrangement was made fraudulently." "Fraudulently?" "Victoria has been attempting to gain unauthorized control of my finances," I explained. "She's currently facing several criminal charges related to elder fraud and identity theft." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Sandra was probably calculating how much legal trouble her facility could face for accepting deposits from someone who didn't have the authority to make them. "In that case," Sandra said finally, "perhaps we should return the deposit to you directly." "That would be appropriate," I agreed. "Though I should mention that I'll be consulting with my attorney about whether additional action is warranted." I could practically hear Sandra's panic through the phone. "Mrs. Morrison, I want to assure you that Sunset Manor had no knowledge of any improper arrangements." "I'm sure you didn't," I said mildly. Though in the future, you might want to verify that the person making deposits actually has authorization to do so. After I hung up, I made a note to have James Bennett send Sunset Manor a formal letter about their questionable intake procedures. It wouldn't accomplish much beyond making them more careful in the future, but every small lesson in accountability was worthwhile. Thomas arrived home from work an hour later, looking exhausted but satisfied in a way I hadn't seen since before his marriage. Learning the family business was challenging him in ways his old engineering job never had, forcing him to think strategically about long-term growth, employee management, and client relationships. "How was your day?" I asked as he collapsed into Robert's old chair in the study. "Complicated," he said with a tired smile. "I spent 3 hours with the Harrison Group, trying to understand why their construction project is 6 weeks behind schedule." The Harrison Group. One of our oldest and most demanding clients, known for changing specifications mid-project and then expecting miracles from the construction timeline. "What did you find?" "They've changed the foundation requirements 3 times, Thomas said, rubbing his eyes. Each time, they acted like it was a minor modification that shouldn't affect the schedule or budget. "And what did you tell them?" "That we'd complete the project according to the latest specifications, but that the additional work would require a change order for both time and materials." I smiled, remembering similar conversations Robert and I had had with difficult clients over the years. "How did they respond?" "About as well as you'd expect," Thomas said with a rueful laugh. "They threatened to find another contractor who'd be more flexible with their requirements. And I told them they were welcome to try, but that any reputable contractor would give them the same answer. The laws of physics don't bend just because someone has an unrealistic deadline." "Your father would have been proud," I said, and meant it. The Thomas who'd been married to Victoria would have probably agreed to the impossible timeline just to avoid conflict, then worked himself into exhaustion trying to deliver the impossible. "I hope so," Thomas said. "I have a lot to make up for." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the grandfather clock tick in the hallway. Through the window, I could see the garden where Robert's roses were beginning their final bloom of the season, their petals catching the late afternoon sunlight. "Mom," Thomas said finally, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why didn't you and Dad ever tell me about the money?" It was a question I'd been expecting. One that deserved a thoughtful answer. "Because we wanted you to become someone who didn't need it." "I don't understand." I leaned back in my chair, thinking about how to explain decisions Robert and I had made years before Thomas was even born. "Your father grew up poor, Thomas. Really poor. His parents worked 3 jobs between them and still barely made ends meet." "I know that. What you don't know is that when Robert inherited his grandfather's small construction business, he was determined never to be poor again. But he was also determined not to raise children who thought money was the answer to everything." Thomas nodded slowly. "So you hid your success." "We lived our values," I corrected. "We wanted you to understand that work has dignity regardless of the paycheck, that relationships matter more than bank balances, that character can't be purchased." "But what if I'd married someone like Victoria anyway?" "Then you would have learned some expensive lessons about choosing partners," I said honestly. "But we were hoping you'd choose better." "I almost didn't." "Almost doesn't count," I said gently. "You figured out what really mattered before it was too late." Thomas was quiet again, staring at his hands the way he'd done as a child when he was working through difficult concepts. "What happens now?" he asked finally. "Now you keep learning the business. You figure out who you are when you're not being manipulated. You decide what kind of life you want to build." "And Victoria?" I shrugged. "Victoria will figure out her own path. Hopefully, she'll learn something from this experience, though I'm not particularly optimistic." As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang again. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was unmistakably Victoria's. "Patricia, we need to talk." No greeting, no pleasantries, just the entitled demand of someone who still believed the world owed her something. "Hello, Victoria. How are you settling into your new apartment?" "Cut the act," she snapped. "I know what you're doing." "I'm not doing anything," I said truthfully. "I'm sitting in my study, talking with my son about his day at work." "You're sabotaging me," Victoria accused. The deposit at Sunset Manor, the credit checks, the rental applications, you're behind all of it. Rental applications. That was interesting. I hadn't been involved in Victoria's housing search, but apparently, her financial situation was raising red flags with potential landlords. Victoria, I haven't contacted anyone about your housing situation. Then why is everyone asking about criminal charges? Why do they all know about the elder fraud investigation? Ah. That explained it. Victoria was discovering that criminal investigations created public records, that background checks revealed pending charges, that her attempts to manipulate and steal had consequences that extended far beyond our family. Perhaps, I suggested mildly, because attempting to defraud elderly people is the kind of thing that shows up on background checks. I never defrauded anyone. You impersonated me to gain access to my financial information, I said patiently. You made arrangements for my care without my consent. You planned to sell my house and control the proceeds. In most jurisdictions, that's called elder fraud. I was trying to help. You were trying to steal, I corrected. And now you're discovering that actions have consequences. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with frustration and growing panic. Victoria was learning that her reputation had preceded her, that small towns had long memories, that being known as someone who'd tried to steal from a grieving widow wasn't exactly a character reference. This is all your fault, she said finally. No, Victoria. This is all your choice. You chose to see my husband's death as an opportunity for profit. You chose to try to manipulate a grieving widow. You chose to steal rather than work for what you wanted. I want to make a deal. What kind of deal? I'll disappear, Victoria said desperately. I'll move away, start over somewhere else. But I need money to do it. Just enough to get established, find a job, rent a decent place. And in exchange, I'll sign whatever papers you want. I'll admit I was wrong. I'll promise never to contact you or Thomas again. A deal. Victoria still thought this was a negotiation, that she had something to offer in exchange for the money she'd failed to steal through manipulation. Victoria, I said gently, you don't have anything I want. I have information about Thomas's engineering firm. I know they're having financial problems. I could cause trouble for his career if I wanted to. Threats now. Victoria had moved from manipulation to extortion, apparently unaware that she was making her situation worse with every word. Victoria, are you threatening my son? I'm just saying that a scandal about his personal life could affect his professional reputation. You mean a scandal about how he discovered his wife was a criminal and divorced her to protect his family? People don't know the whole story. They will if you try to cause trouble, I said calmly. James Bennett has been very thorough in documenting your activities. If you attempt to interfere with Thomas's career, we'll make sure everyone understands exactly what kind of person you are. You can't do this to me. I'm not doing anything to you, I repeated. You're experiencing the natural consequences of your own choices. I'll contest the will anyway, Victoria said desperately. I'll claim you manipulated Robert, that the whole thing was fraud. You're welcome to try, I said. Though I should mention that will contests require money for legal fees, and most attorneys want payment upfront for cases with no chance of success. I'll find a lawyer who works on contingency. For a case where you have no standing to contest, no evidence of manipulation, and a documented history of attempting elder fraud. I laughed. Good luck with that. Victoria made a sound of pure frustration. This isn't over. Yes, it is, I said firmly. It's been over since the moment you decided that my grief was your opportunity. Everything that's happened since then has just been the bill coming due. She hung up without another word, probably already planning her next desperate move. But her options were rapidly diminishing, her reputation was following her wherever she went, and the money she'd been counting on was permanently beyond her reach. Thomas had been listening to my side of the conversation with growing discomfort. She's really desperate, isn't she? Desperate people make poor decisions, I agreed. Victoria's been making poor decisions for months. Now she's dealing with the accumulating consequences. Do you think she'll actually try to cause trouble for me at work? I think she'll try, I said honestly. But I also think she'll discover that people are much more sympathetic to a man who divorced his wife for trying to steal from his grieving mother than they are to the wife who did the stealing. Thomas nodded, but he still looked worried. What if she succeeds in damaging my reputation? Then we'll deal with that when it happens, I said. But Thomas, you have something Victoria doesn't understand. What's that? You have family who will stand by you no matter what. You have a business that's been built on decades of honest dealing and quality work. You have a community that's watched you grow up and knows your character. And Victoria? Victoria has burned every bridge she's crossed, I said simply. She's alone, broke, and facing criminal charges. Even if she could damage your reputation, she can't build herself a better life through destruction. The phone rang again, but this time the caller ID showed James Bennett's office number. Patricia, I have some interesting news about Victoria's situation. Oh. She's been arrested, James said with obvious satisfaction. Attempted extortion, making terroristic threats, harassment. Apparently, she called several of Thomas's colleagues and clients with some very creative stories about his personal life. What kind of stories? The kind that constitute criminal harassment when they are demonstrably false and designed to damage someone's livelihood, James said. She's looking at some serious charges now. I looked at Thomas, who had gone pale listening to my side of the conversation. Is Thomas's reputation safe? More than safe, James assured me. Victoria's calls were so obviously vindictive and false that they actually generated sympathy for Thomas. Several clients have called to express their support and to commend him for protecting his family from such an obviously unstable person. So her plan backfired. Spectacularly, James confirmed. She's managed to torpedo what was left of her credibility while actually strengthening Thomas's reputation. It's almost impressive in its complete failure. After I hung up, Thomas and I sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, the evening light was fading, casting long shadows across the garden where Robert had spent so many peaceful hours. I'm sorry, Mom, Thomas said finally. I'm sorry I brought her into our lives. I'm sorry I let her hurt you. I'm sorry Dad died thinking I'd chosen money over family. Your father didn't die thinking that, I said gently. He died hoping you'd figure out what really mattered before it was too late. And did I? I looked at my son, this good man who'd gotten lost for a while but had found his way back to the values Robert and I had tried to instill in him. You're here, aren't you? You chose family over convenience, honesty over money, loyalty over an easy life. It doesn't feel like enough. It's everything, I said. It's exactly what your father hoped you'd choose when the time came to decide who you really wanted to be. Thomas nodded, tears in his eyes. I miss him. So do I admitted. But I think he'd be proud of how this all turned out. Even though Victoria nearly succeeded. Victoria never had a chance of succeeding, I said with certainty. Because she underestimated what she was up against. She thought she was dealing with a helpless widow and a weak-willed son. She had no idea she was tangling with a family that had spent decades building something worth protecting. The money, you mean? The trust, I corrected. The love. The values. The commitment to taking care of each other. Victoria thought the inheritance was money. She never understood that the real inheritance was the family itself. As night fell over the house that Robert and I had called home for 30 years, I thought about Victoria in her jail cell, probably still planning her next scheme, still believing that the right manipulation could get her the money she felt entitled to. She would never understand that the wealth she'd tried so hard to steal had been built by people who valued each other more than money, who measured success by the strength of their relationships rather than the size of their bank accounts. The inheritance she'd been counting on, the comfortable suburban life funded by someone else's hard work, had never existed except in her imagination. The real inheritance, the one that mattered, could only be earned through loyalty, love, and the willingness to choose family over personal gain. Thomas had earned his inheritance. Victoria had forfeited hers the moment she'd whispered finally, "The old bat is alone" at Robert's funeral. Some lessons, I reflected as Thomas and I shared a quiet dinner in the kitchen where Robert and I had planned our life together, could only be learned through consequences. Some people had to lose everything before they understood what they'd never really had. And some families had to be tested before they discovered how strong they really were. Victoria had provided the test. Thomas and I had passed it. Robert would have been proud of us both.